And commenting, so we've satisfied that element of the agenda. The next item on the agenda is approval of the November 6, 2018 Planning Commission meeting minutes. Do I hear a motion to approve?
I'll make a motion to approve the November minutes.
Thank you. Do I hear a second? Second. Thank you. Discussion? All in favor, raise your hand and say aye. Aye. All opposed, raise your hand and say nay. Any abstentions, raise your hand. That is aye, having not attended the meeting. Motion carries, the minutes are approved. Next item on the agenda, critical areas and shoreline master program amendments. I invite to the presentation table city staff and their consultants.
Good evening. Debbie Bent is not here this evening, just so you know, and so I'll be leading the discussion on the Critical Areas and Shoreline Master Program amendments. So there are three sections in front of you tonight. The first is the second set of the shoreline regulations. So last time we looked at the first part. This is a pretty meaty set of rules having to do with uses and modifications. The second thing we'll talk about is geologically hazardous areas. We have the map now, and this is the new set of regulations that followed the policy direction you gave us at an earlier meeting. And then the third thing is some suggested changes to the groundwater regulations now that we have that map, which is also attached to your packet. And we put a memo at each of your places that is just a background memo on how the groundwater susceptibility mapping was done. I don't anticipate going over that tonight. You haven't had a chance to read it. But we'll send it out also with the next packet, and then it'll go out over the listserv to all the folks who are on our mailing list. And then if you have questions next time, we can collect those and have our scientist answer those questions. So what I would anticipate doing is kind of what we did last time, give you a brief introduction for each of the sections, and then you'll have questions and we can try to answer those. Does that seem okay?
Any objection? Please proceed.
Okay. So the first set, as I mentioned, is the shoreline regulations, and I just wanted to highlight some of the changes that you will see in the material. Again, it's the yellow highlighted information that's new, either additions or deletions. So a big change, and this took a lot of time, was to take our standardized list of uses. You all remember that from a variety of projects. And we put that standardized list of uses into the shoreline regulations. So now the shoreline and the zoning code definition of uses match, and that should make life easier for applicants and sort of the general public. They can follow through with the uses from chapter to chapter. The second thing is that has to do with public access. We're recognizing that there are existing plans for public access in the shoreline, and those are identified in the regulations. And then a suggestion that those plans be considered whenever public access is required. Public access is required for a number of things, and I don't think there are any changes to when it is required, but this says, you know, look at those city plans, try to acknowledge those. And then we added in a new standard that if physical access isn't possible for reasons of safety or other reasons that are itemized in the regulation, then it may be that visual access for the public could be provided, and there might be opportunities for other approaches. For example, if you couldn't provide access on your property, maybe in conjunction with a neighbor, some sort of public access could be provided. The third thing I wanted to point out is that we have put in some sections about long-term maintenance plans, both for parks and for utilities. Currently, those types of ongoing maintenance issues have, every time something needs to happen, for example, dredging at Wallace Swamp Creek Park, a shoreline permit or shoreline exemption has to come in and be processed through the Development Services Department. And what we're trying to do here is allow for multi-year maintenance plan approvals. So not every year do you have to come in if you're doing the same thing every year. So that's a change. There are new standards for highway and street expansion in the shoreline. And then it includes the whole table of modifications such as docks, piers, floats, shoreline stabilization, et cetera. Those have all been put into a table format to make them easier to read. And the standards have been updated along with new standards for repair or replacement and new standards for boat launches. There were two comments that I wanted to point out and how those would be addressed. One was a public comment from the public open house. There were a couple of comments about water access for kayaks and the concern that the preservation of vegetation in the shoreline was making water access for kayaks difficult. There is a section, an existing section, that says that modification to the shoreline is okay for a water-dependent use, but you have to mitigate, and certainly you have to look at whether you're minimizing the impacts for a kayak access. For example, maybe if you needed to take out a very small section of water vegetation, you would put in, Amy calls them willow stakes. I don't know what those are, but it's a way to enhance other vegetation so you can make this sliver to get your kayak in. And then you all had concerns, I think Commissioner Olson raised concerns about liveaboards. We're still researching that question, so I don't have an answer. Yeah. So those were the highlights from the changes in the shoreline regulations, and now it's
All right.
time for questions.
So the staff has asked that we take this up by exception, as we did last time. Any objection to that? Okay, any questions or exceptions to their proposal?
Specifically, are we talking about attachment 1?
Correct. Attachment 1 is the second piece of the shoreline regulations. Correct.
Thank you, Mike. Questions, exceptions? Vice Chair, please.
Yeah, I had a handful of things, but mainly they're probably clarifications. On, excuse me, page 12, looks like that's under attachment 1. So page 12 of attachment 1, talking about the liveaboards. It references there for single-family use only. What's the definition of a single family? In other words, is there like a number of people that would be
So
covered
family
under that?
is defined, and so you can only have a certain number of folks in a residence, for example, in the city. And I want to say it's 8. It's a family that's related by blood or marriage, and I think 8 unrelated individuals. I don't have that definition in front of me, but there is a definition that specifies numbers.
Okay, so it wouldn't be some large party boat, for example. It
No.
would be specifically. I'm just
Yeah, no.
wondering. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And then on the next page, which I guess is page excuse me, page 13. Under accessory uses, it mentions that prohibited uses may be permitted as accessory uses, and I guess I found that kind of curious. Can you maybe talk a little bit about, what that might look like if it's
Right.
otherwise prohibited, why it would be okay as an accessory?
When
use?
we first set up the whole use listing and what an accessory use was, the example we most frequently used, and fortunately it's in the shoreline, is that a jail in the downtown waterfront zone, and it would be in the shoreline, is a prohibited use. However, Kenmore Air has to have a jail because they fly internationally, and there are customs reasons for they have to have a jail on site. So the idea, this is not supposed to be a free-for-all. And that's why it says clearly incidental and necessary for the operation of the permitted use. It's a judgment call, but the zoning code, in fact, specifically, I think, references that example. So that's a case where something might be prohibited typically, but if it's necessary to the main use, then we can consider it.
But again, on a sort of a case-by-case
Correct.
basis, okay. And just one other thing about, on the transportation side, and I probably should know this, but I don't, is 522 included in the shoreline management area?
I think part of 522 is down where Swamp Creek crosses. I'm not sure, I think it's probably too far as we move westward. It's not 200 feet from the shoreline, it's much farther than that. But there is that one area where Swamp Creek crosses over, and then there may be an area where the river gets close enough. I'm not positive.
It looks like maybe at the very east end where there's those residential parcels that perhaps it goes a few feet into
Right.
the highway.
So any potential expansion of 522 in that area would be presumably covered under,
It would have to
These
follow the
regulations.
shoreline, right, it would have to follow the shoreline regulations.
is there anything in there that, stands out that might become an issue for work on 522 at that?
Off the top, I'm not
Location.
sure, but I think we certainly can look at that question. I think that's a legitimate question.
Just
so-
wondering, right?
Yeah.
Okay, and just one more thing. I promise this is the last one. You talk about, on page 34 of the attachment, you talk about invasive aquatic weeds may be removed, and it says, chemicals are applied by a licensed applicator and approved for aquatic use. Approved by whom?
The, do you want?
It's a Department of Ecology.
Okay, so it's a government
Yeah.
and
yeah,
regulatory
it's-
entity of some kind, okay.
And
Not-
our shoreline planner, I think, is going to ask, I'm not sure why we took out the part about licensed applicator, but that's a question I think that, is it still in there?
Yeah,
In some other places, not.
maybe not in.
Yeah,
Oh, maybe not in the, maybe in the shoreline, right? Sorry about that little digression here. We're saying in some place it's not there, and I think it's in the comprehensive plan. And our ecology planner, Maria Sanderco, who you met one time, had called that out. But here in the actual regulations, it does say by a licensed applicator.
Okay.
So
And then
governed
the
by
next
ecology.
paragraph, it talks about demonstrating no net loss of ecological functions. How and to whom does that need to be demonstrated? To the city, about the mitigating impacts of new or expanded water access structures and a mitigation plan?
I think it would be part of a critical areas report that you'd submit to the city. And it would need to address no net loss in that report.
Okay. To the city?
To the city,
to
yeah.
satisfaction,
It'll also
okay.
be reviewed by state and federal agencies, but under different standards.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Anybody else? Commissioner Mulcair?
Yeah, I had a few questions on the public access language. And I must say I got a little confused as I went through it. There are some deletions on page 11 that refer to public access. Old paragraph number 3 before the deletion. And then more importantly, on page 16, a section on public access. And having read that, I'm really not quite sure what the requirements are for a requirement for public access.
So the pages that you're looking at, these are footnotes to different uses. And then there's
Footnotes to the table?
footnotes to the table.
Yep.
So that most likely would come up under parks, potentially under outdoor recreation. And so these apply to individual uses in the table. And then public access itself is discussed in a different section, I believe, if I can find it.
1650-060 on page 16.
Right, so that more specifically would call out the public access standards. Is there one in particular?
I guess understanding the difference between public access as a requirement for public projects or the development on public lands versus the requirement for public access for development on private property. And the second sentence of that introductory paragraph to the public access section is the one I guess I was having some trouble with. For development on private property, public access shall be required when such development would either generate or increase demand for public access. That almost seems like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Right? If on private land, someone is developing the property in such a way that would increase the demand for public access, they must offer public access?
Right, I think the idea is that if you're doing the type of a use that would bring people close to the water, a primary focus of the shoreline rules is public access. So that, for example, if you were doing some sort of say a water-related retail use in the shoreline, and you were bringing people in to your facility, the goal would be that you would also provide public access of some sort to the water, whether that's you can walk down to the end of the property and look out at the water, or you have visual access, again, if you can't do it. So the standards are that if it's public property, yes, you have to provide public access, but you can see if you look through this whole list that almost everything else is supposed to provide public access unless there's a safety, security kind of a reason that you can't provide it.
Right. Is there a use case that you were thinking of with this? And this may be pre-existing language, so it's not anything that was developed recently, although there is some new additions to it for sure. I'm just wondering what a scenario would be. For example, if I think about the marina
Right.
adjacent to the air harbor, which has, a number of piers and docks, and I would say it creates public interest or a demand for public access.
Right.
Yet, my understanding is those are not there's not public access. Those are behind gated fences.
Well, I'm not sure which, are you talking about Harbor Village Marina?
Yes.
That has a public access pier.
It does.
So that actually from the parking lot, you can walk down by the main building there where the person who controls the marina sits, and you can go around the side, and then there's actually a sign out to public access, and quite a bit of the area out there beyond where most of the boat slips are is public access,
Okay.
right up against the water. And that this is pre-existing language, and this is the kind of language that would have achieved that.
Okay, so this is nothing new necessarily.
No.
And this is also based on requirements of the Shoreline Management Act, which does a lot to try and promote and increase the amount of public access in communities. So pretty much the only thing that doesn't require public access in the long run really is a single-family residence. If it was a subdivision, then as you see here, multifamily development, and it doesn't mean that everybody's front yard would be public access, but you need to provide some sort of element in the greater subdivision plan that would allow people to come and view the water or get access to the water in some physical way.
Okay, that helps a lot. So they don't necessarily have to provide public access to the development or the feature that's generating the interest. They just have to provide public access to the water
Right.
on which that interesting feature is located. Interest-generating feature is
Right,
located.
right, exactly. On that property, somehow using that property as a means to get to experience and enjoy the water.
Okay. I just had another very kind of small clarification question. On page 26 in the shoreline modifications table, on the bottom of that page, there's differentiations around boat launches, both residential and public, and then motorized and non-motorized. And my question is, how do we differentiate? When we say motorized or non-motorized, are we talking about the types of vessels that are launched there?
Yes.
And is that mutually exclusive? In other words, if something is non-motorized, a motorized, are these completely distinct things? Or I'm imagining there are boat launches that, let's say it's residential, right, that could be both motorized and non-motorized.
Yeah, I think the distinction, or how I think about it, and maybe that does, your question suggests that maybe we need to do a word change here, but typically the motorized ones, and they could obviously have non-motorized access at those, but those are typically concrete and they're formal and there's much more dramatic impacts and site alterations, and then there's the use associated with the boats. But whereas the non-motorized access typically is just a space to walk your kayak to the water, and maybe it's like a gravel, gently graded slope kind of thing. So there's, one of the reasons we differentiate is not because it's motorized boat or non-motorized boat, but because motorized facilities usually require those hard surfaces in order to get them into the water. And so it's degrees of impact that we're trying to address.
I think we might want to look at
Yeah,
the
I agree.
wording there.
Yep.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Commissioner Olson?
I go back to, I think it's page 14 of attachment 1, and it's the section dealing with accessory uses and my only question there is, because of some of the limitations and the depth of less than 50 feet and the dry land parking within 800 feet, how does this deal with disabled or handicapped?
There's a standard, I think it's at the beginning of the Shoreline Master Program that specifically speaks to that the standards can be modified to address ADA access. Is that?
Yes, and it's not coming to me exactly how it's worded off the top of my head. And then there's also a shoreline exemption that's been added, so that if you're making changes to a project solely to make it ADA accessible, then that activity doesn't require a shoreline permit.
So we can pull out the specific section that addresses that for next time?
In that same paragraph, Dennis, that you were just mentioning, that was paragraph 3, newly numbered 3.
I would specifically referred to it.
Yeah. It mentions there that the director determines, and I noticed throughout this attachment, director had been changed to city manager.
That is standard now in the zoning code. When we rewrote the zoning code, I think it was in 2011, 2012, the determination, the code used to say the director of this department, the director of this department, the department names changed, the relationships changed. So the idea was to replace every time that appeared with the word, with the italicized definition, city manager, which means city manager or his or her designee, so that the city manager is the one who specifies who makes all of these decisions. It's generally the director of development services.
How is director being used in this paragraph?
In 3?
Page 14, paragraph 3.
Okay. Well, see, you caught me. Thank you. It
There's a
should be
long
city
wind up there,
manager.
but-
I thought I thought you were asking, why does it say city manager? Thank you for
Sure.
catching that. It should be city manager. A very thorough read.
Yeah.
Anybody else? No? All right, so I think there's, subject to those comments, approval of attachment 1.
Fine.
So
There's
next,
some, I'm sorry, there's
Yeah,
some
please.
language on page 11 regarding the liveaboards. Is that going to be revisited later?
Right. As soon as we get, Dennis had asked us to look at the whole issue of liveaboards and how you would handle a liveaboard that wasn't in a marina, if someone were tying up temporarily or
Right.
something like that. So we were doing some research on that, and we don't have it yet. So that will be something that we'll be bringing back.
It's being used here on page 11 more definitionally, right?
Correct. So these two things, floating homes and overwater residences, are defined in the Shoreline Management Act. And those are not liveaboards. Those are more like, what's the term I'm thinking of? Houseboats, thank you. Those are really houseboats. We're talking about boats, literal boats that people are living on when we're talking about liveaboards.
Can I have a comment on that? I was down in Sausalito in California, and we went to this development that my brother's doing, and the harbor master says, see all those boats out there, anchored out there? They're all basically tweakers, as he called them, these dilapidated boats, and they're all living out there in the bay. And there's hundreds of them. There's a real problem because, and then they come onto the shore and they use the facilities there, and it's a real detriment to the area, so to speak. And in fact, there was one big, about 80-foot sailboat, and there was a murder on there, and the guy who owns the boat doesn't even go on the boat because all these people are just, showing up and staying there, and it's just crazy.
Yeah. Well, our standard would say they have to be located in the marina. So they have to be in the marina, and if they're in the marina, they're paying for a slip. So, and the person managing the marina is responsible for making sure that, legitimate
Yeah, I just bring that
residents
up
are
because
there.
it reminded
Yeah.
me of that.
Yeah, well, the good news
scenario.
is that I think our standard would prevent that.
Yeah.
And then once we address Dennis's concern about temporary.
If someone was squatting or living aboard without the owner's permission, what enforcement laws control? Is it maritime? Is it residential eviction?
And this guy, this harbor master, he says that the police don't want to do anything about it because they don't want to go out on the water, and they don't even want to deal with them when they come and trespass going on the docks. And because they just kind of go, not my problem.
Right.
So, but it was pretty interesting. We had a long conversation about that. It was really interesting.
I think in the lake, DNR has control over what vessels in the lake, and that if you were going to moor there for any length of time, you have to get a lease to have your boat there. So the state has a role on Lake Washington, and then we also have a King County Police boat that can manage on the water kinds of issues. So again, I think we're in a kind of a different situation, hopefully a situation that would not allow something like that.
I think the city of Edmonds was dealing with some confusion over controlling law with their liveaboards in there. That's Puget Sound, so
Right.
probably different
Yeah.
agencies controlling, but they had people they essentially couldn't evict, but were living in very unsanitary and unhealthy conditions, and there wasn't much they could do about it.
Right, and the other thing is that the private property owner, Harbor Village Marina, would have a role as well. I mean, presumably they're managing their residents, their boats.
Anything else? Are we good with attachment 1? All right.
All right?
Lori,
So-
do you guys want to add to your background on attachment 2?
Yeah,
Okay.
that'd be great. Okay, so a couple of meetings ago, not a couple weeks ago, a couple of meetings ago, we brought forward the idea for the geologic hazard areas to look at now that we have better information from the LIDAR work, LIDAR mapping work, we know where sort of the high landslide hazard areas are. And then the question was, should we treat high landslide hazard areas differently than we treat moderate landslide hazard areas? And we agreed that for moderate landslide hazard areas, because we don't have all of the LIDAR information yet, we would use the extent of our current maps, which just show in general landslide hazard areas. And so you all have at the end of this section, which is attachment 2, there should be at the very last page. And in fact, Bridget sent out a revised version because we initially attached the wrong map. But you now have a map showing you where the high hazard are and where the moderate hazard are. And then there are different standards for those two areas. So for high landslide hazard areas, the idea is that you cannot develop on a high landslide hazard area unless you obtain a reasonable use exception. It's like developing on a property with highly constrained by wetlands, for example. You have to show that you're doing the minimum necessary, but you own a lot that is so constrained that you have to somehow vary the standards. For moderate landslide hazard areas, we go back to just requiring the critical areas report, the geohazard report that shows that you're not creating a problem, not affecting your neighbors, that kind of thing. So the standards are in here similarly to the existing standards. We also added standards for trails in landslide hazard areas. And for those properties that may be divided or subdivided that are partly in, first of all, you can't subdivide a property in a landslide hazard area. That just is, just expands on the problem. So in this case, if you are partially in a landslide hazard area and partially outside of it, then we've written in provisions, if you're in the R4 zone, which is what most of our landslide hazard areas are zoned, you can have smaller lots. We're not increasing, you can't have more lots than you could. We're not increasing the density, but we're allowing smaller lots so that you can put those lots outside of the landslide hazard area and maybe get the 4 or 5 houses that you would have been able to get if you could develop in the landslide hazard area. So those are kind of the highlights for that. I know that the commission, here are a couple of other comments. The commission was concerned about defining remodeling and properties in high landslide hazard areas. We wanted to make sure that if something was already built in a high landslide hazard area, that you could do your remodeling and potentially your expansion to your existing house. And so we talked about whether we should put a size threshold on that or not. And the conclusion was it's possible that based on where you were in the feature, you could do a little tiny remodel that would have bad effect. Or you could do, in a different part of that feature, a significant remodel that really wouldn't have any impact. So the idea was we didn't put a size threshold on the expansion or remodeling. We just said, get a geotechnical report that shows us that you're not creating a worse situation if you're an existing structure in a high landslide hazard area. And then the other thing is that the commission, when we were going through the gap analysis, you wanted an applicant to be able to help choose the third-party reviewer. If we were requiring a geotechnical report, they submitted one. We didn't think it was adequate. The city said we need a third-party review of this because we're not completely comfortable. Then if the city chose someone to do that report, it's now written in that the applicant would also have to agree to that choice. So.
Okay. Comments? Go ahead.
Yeah, just on that last point, is that is it likely that there would be agreement so the process wouldn't get, drawn out indefinitely with sort of dueling, potential reviewers? I mean, I guess there's no incentive really for the applicant to kind of, postpone it indefinitely, but
Right.
is that a pretty straightforward process that the city and the...
It can be. I was talking with Samantha in Development Services about it, and I guess King County has a list of geotech. The city doesn't have a list of recommended geotechnical engineers or analyzers, but King County does have such a list. And I think if someone was saying, we don't like the person that you're typically using, the city would probably go to the King County list where we know they've been vetted and recommend somebody on that list. I can't imagine why an applicant would say no. I mean, they have no motivation.
Hey, you know what? Hey, this isn't a public participation thing. Oh, no. Yeah, it's, if you look at the agenda, you'll see there is a segment devoted to citizen comment. So that, and that, you are right in that sense, but I didn't want you to misunderstand that we're all in this sort of pool of conversation. But you're welcome to listen. If afterward you have questions, feel free to ask. Thanks. Go ahead.
So you're right. Price could be an issue, and maybe the, however many people are on the King County list are, you know, we get estimates from those folks.
Yep.
That,
So when, I mean, the vice chair raises a pretty good point. It comes up a lot in legal disputes. If there's difficulty choosing a decision maker like an arbitrator, one of the tiebreakers that's commonly used is that each side will pick somebody, and the two chosen arbitrators will then choose a third if they can't be agreed to. So the city might
interesting.
say, we like X. The citizen might say, I don't like X, I'd like Y. I choose Y. City would say, no, we're not going to go with Y, but X and Y would choose Z.
gotcha.
So if commissioners like that tiebreaker approach, because it is hard, you know, on its face, it's not something you would think would be challenged, and maybe it never has been challenged, but is it possible? Yeah.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's not even in good faith, but people get sideways with the city, and they want to use that as a lever or a, you know, an axe to grind or something.
And who pays for the city's choice? Does-
The applicant.
So he's got to pay two experts then?
Only if there's a sense that the initial report is not adequate. That we would never go to another review unless,
Well, what's the cost of these geotech reports?
yeah, I don't know. I think it probably depends on the size of the proposal
Sure.
and where it's located.
So what do you, as the city, do you guys, how do you vet these people to be, you know, neutral? Is there, I mean, in my world, I see doctors that attend to, you know, get reports on my clients, and they're always biased. They always come, I can write the report for them every time. How do you avoid that kind of scenario in this situation?
Well, again, the idea is that the applicant chooses the initial geotech. So the city doesn't choose the initial geotech.
Right.
The applicant chooses, and the applicant submits a report, and then, why don't we look at the specific, and then so this section says, at its discretion, the city may require applicants to fund a third-party review. So it's in a case where the city, perhaps it's such a dangerous area that the city would like to absolutely be certain that there's no problem. And so the city would say, okay, we have this report, but we think we need another person to look at it as well. And that's the time when this third-party geotech would be selected to look at the first report, and then hopefully the two concur and the development can proceed. But it's a fail-safe in a case where you're in an area that could potentially be a hazard, either to the future occupants or to the neighbors, and the city is wanting to be extra cautious about allowing development there.
So is there an interest in having a tiebreaker language in this?
I think that's a good backup
Is that
plan.
tiebreaker process that you mentioned, does it work?
Yeah, I've never seen it not work. I mean, I don't do a lot of litigation. Scott might have more experience with that.
Well, usually the insurance company pays for it, and it mostly happens in adjusting on motor vehicles, on total losses. And you get your appraiser, and they get their appraiser, and if they don't agree, then they get a third one, or on injury cases, UIM, underinsured motorist cases, they'll have each side picks one, and then they pick a neutral. But the insurance companies pay for it all. And, if you've got a guy with a little remodel, and he gets a geotech, and then he's got to pay another geotech for the city, and then a third geotech, if you go to the tiebreaker, it could be, break the bank.
It could be expensive, yeah.
Yeah, that's my only concern about
Well,
the third
sure.
one, yeah.
I don't think you'd be paying for the city's geotech if you objected to the city's geotech. So the only role the city's geotech would be is to agree with the citizens' geotech on the third neutral geotech.
I understood that you said that the cities would be paid by the applicant.
If accepted.
Right, so the applicant pays for the report to come in, and then if the city is concerned that the report is not adequate, then the way it's set out here is that the city and the applicant would agree on a second geotech report. And Doug is talking about a case where the second geotech could not be, they couldn't agree on that person. So then the two of them would pick another person, but again, it would only be 2 geotech reports.
Which they'd have to do anyway.
Right, correct.
Okay, you're saying that the second, the city's choice is they don't agree, then, okay, so they're not, the applicant is not going to be charged for the city's expert, then I take it.
Because the city's not, expert isn't going to review the report because the applicant disagreed to
If the
having them
applicant
do it.
objects, the only role for the city's geotech is to choose the neutral geotech.
Oh, I was thinking that the city would get their report, and then if they didn't agree, you go to the third person. You're saying that if the city's choice, before he does any work at all, has an objection to that person.
Right, or if the city, the city, I suppose, could run it by their geotech to see whether he thought a third report was warranted, but we wouldn't ask the applicant to pay for that. That's like part of the city's review process. And then the second report would be the mutually agreed upon or chosen by the 2 geotechs who were rejected. Am I
Yeah,
getting
it
that
makes
right?
sense to me. That's what I had in mind.
Yeah,
So I don't even think this will be used very much for the reasons that Lori
Right.
just said. If somebody submits a report and the city challenges it, they'll probably go with the city's geotech's comments on it, but we're in the business where people have a lot of bad blood and they look for excuses sometimes to object to things, and this would resolve it more efficiently than having nothing in the code. So I'm going to move that we propose a tiebreaker by which the city's geotech and a citizen's geotech could choose a third neutral geotech to resolve dispute as to which geotech will have controlling decision on the geotech report. Do I hear a second? Second. Discussion?
I just,
Go ahead. Well, either one.
Just in your experience with a similar tiebreaker rule, is
Yeah.
is it more probable than not that the 2 assessment agencies will be able to mutually agree on an independent?
It's more probable than not.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, they have an interest. It's not going to go away.
Right.
And both sides want to resolve this. Obviously, the citizen is not going to get anything done without city approval, so they want to get somebody, the key to it, of course, is getting somebody in either part that has a vested bias or something with either party.
could I do
Go
a
ahead, Scott.
friendly amendment that if you go to the tiebreaker, that the applicant doesn't pay for the city's geotech?
Is that a problem, Lori?
I'm not sure what you mean. Are you saying that if they go to the tiebreaker, then the applicant doesn't pay for the second report?
No,
The role that the city's geotech plays in selecting or disapproving the report. Is that what you have in
Yes.
mind?
Yeah, I think, let me think about where the best place to put that is. But if the commission wants to do that, we can put that in there.
Okay.
Yeah,
And
because the reason I think it needs to be, if it's not stated, then somebody want to say, well, you need to pay for the whole thing, and then the guy's paying for 3 geotechs, and that's a little onerous in my book.
Yeah, and that was never the intent, to pay for 3.
Okay. Yeah, but it doesn't hurt to have the language in there. so
Right.
it eliminates the
My
risk.
only question is whether it actually belongs in the code or it belongs in the fee schedule. But I don't think it would hurt to put it in the code. I can't imagine why it would.
It'll be
So,
more prominent there anyway. So, go ahead, Mike.
This may be obvious, but I just want to make sure. If you go to a tiebreaker, this is in effect a binding arbitration situation, so that once you go to there, whatever that decision of the arbiter is, that's final. So you don't have a continuing reappeal going on. You have to, if you're going to go to that, you have to accept the finding.
Well, I don't know if that, I mean, there's probably an appeal option for anybody who objects to the city's rejection of a report or there's a dispute over it, right?
well, there would be an appeal of a permit, for example, if there were a permit denial.
Right.
If there would be an appeal that way.
Right. So, Mike, that would substantively change the process to say everybody's bound by the neutral third geotech's decision, because then the citizen would lose a chance to appeal the denial of the permit. For that reason, at
I didn't know
least.
that, but I get it.
Yeah.
But what that brings to my mind, I mean, what's the point of a third-person arbiter if there's always going to be another step in this?
Well, that's always true. In a legal dispute, for example, we're just looking for a neutral judge at the outset. Just getting the neutral judge doesn't waive rights to
Finding
appeal.
the neutral judge,
I'm
then
sorry?
If you don't accept the finding of the neutral judge, then all you're doing is grinding through more process.
You have to have grounds for an appeal. So if the neutral judge did something either, well, typically it's procedural. You have a lot of discretion substantively. That would be your basis for appealing to probably Superior Court under this permit review or permit appeal. LUPA, is that what it's called?
Right, the
A
21
LUPA
days.
action?
Assuming it's not, it
So
could
you
be
can't- I mean, you
connected to
could,
another
I
permit.
suppose, just churn the process, but to say, we're not going to have any appeals here does change the rights of the citizen. It cuts them off at some point.
I mean, that is the point of binding arbitration.
No, the point of binding arbitration, right, but I wasn't proposing that. I was just proposing a neutrality process. But the binding part is another element, it's a new element. There are merits on either side, but I didn't want to take that on. If you want to propose that, that's
No,
fine.
I'm not proposing it, but I do want to understand
Yeah.
how this plays out.
You are right.
So-
I mean, typically, if you go to arbitration, it depends on the language or the statute that imposes arbitration on a legal dispute. It's typically, at least with contracts, binding, so that you don't go on and on and on.
So,
We have a lot of us in my profession have experience with binding arbitration.
Yeah.
When you don't have binding arbitration and what that does to cost.
Yeah.
so what we would typically do would be that the report would come in. We would propose that the city's geotech review, and then that review would determine whether a third-party review was needed. And then, once that review came in, it could go two ways. The third-party review could say, I agree with the first geotech and everything is fine, or that reviewer could say, I disagree, and we would go with that disagree, given that it was selected by the two together. I mean, that's what we'd go with, and either we'd decline the permit and then the person would have their appeal option.
I like preserving the applicant's appellate
Right of
rights.
appeal. I mean, you got to be pretty aggrieved, like Scott was saying, this is expensive. Keeps going and going.
I'm not proposing
Yeah.
anything here.
Yeah.
But I want to understand it.
Yeah.
I can see from the description here that if you went through this process and then you wanted to appeal, you've got an awful lot of information out there that would be in itself a high hurdle to get over in any kind of appeal process.
Yeah.
So understanding that, I feel more comfortable about it.
It's a good point you raise. Anybody else? So we have a motion, and Commissioner McDonald's proposed an amendment to the motion. Do I hear a second to the proposed amendment? Second. Okay. Discussion of the motion is amended. Any? I know we've pretty much done it. The door was open. All right. Yes, Commissioner Wilson.
Just a question, I'm just sort of waiting for them to put together the language.
Of the amendment,
Well, of everything.
or of the motion?
Yeah,
as amended.
But we talked earlier about going to, vetted it. Does that have some reference to that?
No.
Do we need to rephrase the pending motion as amended?
Seems to me,
Yeah.
and I don't know, have a body of vetted people, you might want to say that second reviewer
I have mixed feelings about that, because the vetting was done by the county. Maybe the city first has its list, and the county, you said, at second has a list. The cities, I mean, the screening device for that is that the city has to, the city's geotech would have to agree to the neutral third geotech. So they're already going to have their preferences. And if they think somebody's unqualified, they're not going to agree. I don't think they would, to me, I would like to broaden the list. There's probably lots of qualified geotechs who aren't on it. Citizen might have a reason to think I'm more comfortable with the non-county approved geotech.
I understand
And the county gets as, or the city gets as much say on that process anyway. That's just my comment on that point. Anybody else is welcome to chip in.
I agree what you said.
Okay. All right. Do we think it would be helpful, anybody, to rephrase the pending motion as amended? Are you good with it,
Okay.
Lori?
My understanding is that we're going to set up a tiebreaker option so that if the two can't agree, then their two select, the two geotechs they've selected will choose the third person.
Right.
And that will be the tiebreaker, that the applicant should not pay for that initial city review to determine whether a third report is needed, was your friendly amendment.
Well, was not paying the city's choice under any circumstance. Not just to say that he wants to go to a third party, or a neutral, I should say. I just don't want the applicant to have to pay for more than his geotech and the tiebreaker.
No, I understand that, but when the report comes in, the city's geotech will look at it, potentially, along with the Development Services Department, and they will make a call about whether a third-party review is needed. That review process, I thought, was what you were saying you did not want the applicant to pay for. But once the third party or the tiebreaker or whoever is selected, then the applicant would pay for that second report.
Yeah, and only paying the neutral, not the, I don't know if the city's expert hangs around the process and then gets some more hours in it, and then the city might say, oh, the applicant needs to pay for that. That's my concern.
Yeah. I will have to check with Development Services about whether they bill out the review time. I don't think that they do. I think that's covered by the permit fees, but I will double check that. Okay?
So subject to that additional research, we have a motion. And Lori, was there, and then we wanted to add, I guess nothing. I mean, Mike's point just means, or yeah, Mike Manderline's point was one of clarification. So I think that's how the amended motion is intended. Does that sound right, Lori? Everybody else? We're good on the content? Right, further discussion? Okay. Oh, so the vote on the motion, all in favor, raise your hand and say aye. Aye. All opposed, raise your hand and say nay. Are there any abstentions? There being none, the motion carries and is approved. Are there any more comments or exceptions to attachment 2?
On this end?
Yes.
I have some language questions. At the bottom of page 4 starts a section on performance standards. And in the paragraph A at the bottom of that same page, it talks about activities on sites containing erosion hazards shall meet the following requirements. So that sets the context that the requirements that follow are for sites, which I interpret as parcels or lots, that would contain an erosion hazard. And if we look at the map, we can see that the erosion hazard areas can be really narrow bands. And in many cases, I'm assuming they don't take an entire site. They may split a site. As we get into some of the requirements that follow, some of them further define what's meant by the erosion hazard area. Sometimes it says, like in section 1, that buffers are not required when an entire area is categorized only as an erosion, meaning, I guess, to the exclusion of landslide area.
Correct.
And then in section 2, it talks about implemented in an erosion. So, and it goes on to do that in some of the other paragraphs as well. So in the very first paragraph, we define it as sites that contain, but then as we get into each one of the requirements, we talk more specifically about the area itself. And when I look at something like section 3 on vegetation shall be retained, they seem like they're in conflict, right? If it applies just to the erosion hazard area, which may or may not mean the entire site, if I read that first section A, it would include the site that contains the erosion hazard. So if I'm a site owner and I want to remove vegetation, I don't know which way this is going to lead me. If it applies to my entire site because my site contains an erosion hazard area?
No.
Or is it specific to the area
It's
itself?
specific to the area. So if
Okay.
you would like, we could say erosion hazard areas shall meet the following requirements.
Yeah, that takes the confusion away. I guess my follow-up to that would be, how, with these LIDAR mappings, how specific can we be? If I'm a site owner and I want to remove vegetation, and I know that there is a part of my site
Right.
that is designated an erosion hazard area, are we down to the foot or the meter or the?
So the map is not the defining feature, and the LiDAR doesn't have anything to do with erosion hazard areas. It's only for the landslide hazard areas. So the definition of the erosion hazard area is back in the previous section, in 1855-620 on page 2. And it says erosion hazard areas are those areas identified by the U.S. Department of Agriculture Natural Resources Conservation Service, or identified by a special study as having a moderate to severe, or very severe erosion potential. So it would be the map by the Natural Resources Conservation Service, which I assume is translated into the map that we have here. And so what you'd be looking at, if you have a site that looks like it has a mapped erosion hazard on it, you'd be looking at a critical areas report that talked about whether there was an erosion hazard area, and then what the mitigations were, and whether you needed to comply with the standards. So the map is a flag to say we think you're in this area, and then the critical areas report defines it.
How will a site owner know? If they wanted to remove vegetation from a hillside, they're not aware that it is an erosion area.
So a site owner shouldn't be removing vegetation without a city permit. That would be a clearing permit, and there are standards for clearing in the city, standards for tree removal, et cetera. So they would not presumably be doing that without having talked with the city about whether or not.
So, I'm sorry, but do blackberry removals require a clearing permit?
No, probably not. But if you're on a steep slope, how are you going to, are you going to remove the blackberries by hand? Are you going to grade the slope? How, it's a discussion of what exactly are you doing. I can't imagine somebody is going to hand grub out blackberries on a steep slope. Now, maybe they are. And if that were the case, we might not have an issue with it. But if they were bringing in a machine to do it, they would have to get a clearing permit from the city.
Yeah, I guess, I don't know if vegetation is defined anywhere, but I can imagine there are all types of seasonal vegetation removal that occur across the city, and I'm not sure if people would know that that would trigger a clearing permit, or that they would even be within an erosion hazard area when they're doing it. And I am imagining probably more the residential scenario where they're doing it by hand.
Well, and again, it depends on what you're thinking about doing. Everybody works in their yard, trims their trees, rakes up their leaves, et cetera. That's different from taking an area, probably an erosion hazard because of I assume there's some sort of geologic feature that defines that, and going in and doing major clearing of that area. That's what this is designed to capture.
Right.
And so again, it's a matter of a degree. If someone went out on their erosion hazard area and removed a blackberry bush, I don't think the city would care. But if you're talking about a more extensive development or clearing or grading, then the city would care. And you would come to the city and you would look at the map, and we would say it's an erosion hazard area, get a critical areas report, and tell us how you meet these standards.
Right. And I know in other parts of this attachment, grading is defined separately, and other activities that we just mentioned were defined separately. This was specifically, I guess, around the vegetation shall be retained.
Right.
I wondered if that was overly broad. If this is existing language, and it appears that it is, and it's working for the city today, we don't need to change it. It just, the most important part was kind of clearing up the difference between the site and the area, and it sounds like we did that, but,
Yeah.
On the blackberries, the big blackberries, the ones that are invasive, I guess the best way to get rid of them is with goats. So, but if you bring the goats in there and
Goats are
they eat all the blackberries, is that going to fall under it? Because they are an invasive a plant to this area, and they really overtake a person's yard pretty quickly. And it's a good point, I think.
well, it's something I do every year on my property, and I know, looking at the map, I'm in an erosion. That orange striped path goes through my property, so it is something I don't want to have to worry about.
Right.
And I haven't had the police knocking on my door yet.
Have you hired any goats?
I don't want to say because I didn't get a goat permit.
No.
I think what Lori was saying about scale and the actual location, like removal of a single blackberry plant's not going to do anything, but there have been some pretty dramatic slides triggered by property owners in Seattle, I think, and Shannon and Wilson worked on one of those where the owner thought, I'm going to do a great thing and I'm going to clear out all this blackberry. And that, when you had a rain event after that, it caused a massive landslide and took out some utilities and a variety of things. So blackberry needs to be considered when you've got an erosion hazard area or any kind of a landslide or some other kind of feature for erosion and sedimentation and safety and all those kind of issues. So I think it would probably not be a good idea to restrict it to just say native vegetation or anything, because even blackberry vegetation can do a really great job holding on to the soil and keeping it from going downhill.
And it probably, when it does invade that area, it kills off whatever native vegetation is there, sort of replaces it.
Yeah,
right?
right.
Any more comments on attachment 2? Going once, twice. All right, so I think, subject to what's been stated already,
Right.
we have approval of attachment 2.
Okay. All right, so attachment 3, you actually saw at your last meeting. This is an entirely new section. And now that we have the map, which shows the areas of moderate and high groundwater susceptibility, we have gone back to look at these proposed regulations and are recommending that this first standard, activities that divert, alter, or reduce the flow of surface or groundwaters, including dewatering or otherwise reduce groundwater recharge, we've eliminated the requirement that that should have to get this type of a hydrogeological report. The city's surface water standards, when people are looking at development and what they're going to do with their diverted surface water, through those surface water regulations, things like is it going to be infiltration, how far are they from the depth, what is the depth to groundwater, et cetera. Those types of issues are looked at through the surface water rules. And we didn't want to put this additional burden of getting this type of report on, it would affect almost every project. We didn't want to put that additional burden on. We feel like the issues are addressed through the city's surface water requirements, and therefore the only time this hydrogeological assessment would be required is if you had a use that was dealing with hazardous substances, other than household hazardous substances, or injection wells, or anything that we can't imagine that the city manager would say that is a threat to groundwater. So that is the change we are recommending with this modified section on groundwater.
Thank you. Any exceptions or comments? Going once? Okay. Like we have commission approval of that proposed language.
Okay.
So does that cover the balance of what we have to review, or I know there are a couple more attachments, but I thought they related to this.
Right. This covers the items that we had hoped to go over tonight.
Okay.
So at the next meeting, December 18, it's going to be the third and last part of the shoreline regulations. And then we may come back with answers to some of these questions that are still kind of hanging out there, and other potential tweaks to the regulations related to that. So that's kind of our agenda for the 18th.
Very good. All right. That satisfies tonight's agenda. Do I hear
Oh.
any? Go ahead.
Sorry. When you all are finished with your discussion, I want to speak just briefly about January meeting dates.
Right.
If we could do that.
Well, go ahead.
Okay. So your first meeting in January is January 1st, and I don't imagine that you will want to be here. So your second meeting in January, what we are proposing is your second meeting in January, which is the 15th, become your first meeting in January. And then we maybe think about a special meeting on January 29th, which is a couple of weeks later. That would make only a week gap between that meeting and your February 5th regular meeting date. So I wanted to throw that out there and see if you like that approach.
What was that date again for the?
January 29. So it was January 15 and January 29. And then we'd go back to February 5th, and then the second meeting in February.
Objections?
Just to clarify, wasn't one of those supposed to be a public hearing?
We are getting close to the
Okay.
public hearing. So I expect that probably on the 15th of January, we will be wrapping up. One big piece that we have left is the public agency utility exception. That would be something on the 15th. And then either that night or the 29th, depending, we would sort of have the whole package of amendments for you to look at one last time before the public hearing, which again could be the 29th, although I think we would prefer to do that on a regular meeting night, so probably February 5th.
All right. Mike?
Point of order.
Yeah.
Our next meeting will be the last meeting for some folks on the commission.
That's right. One person on the commission.
these dates in January would be beyond until we have some word on it.
Right, right. The city council is interviewing 8 candidates on next Monday, the 10th, and will select someone to fill the one vacancy, and then they may settle on a sort of a pool, which they've done in the past for unexpected vacancies.
You're going to have to add one more person on that list because I'm going to be resigning here. I got to get to.
Oh,
Yeah, I need to get a little bit more work done at the office.
well, that's sad news.
Yeah.
And so if, technically, if you want to send in an email and we'll let the city manager and the city council know.
Yeah, it's been fun.
Mark, or Scott and I are going to play a lot of golf together. As soon as we resign.
That's right. You gotta live retired.
Gotta go with it. Full disclosure.
Do you use an arbitrator to resolve this?
Yeah. We'll each pick somebody, who will then pick somebody. Yeah. That's how it's gonna work. Because I don't trust him. I just can't. All right. Anything else? Any other announcements? That was a biggie. Well, top that.
I'm not going to try to. You had offered for some in the audience to make comments at the end of it.
Well, actually, I'd said that the citizen comment part's on the agenda, but yeah, if, you missed it. I mean, you showed up afterward, but you're welcome if you want to render some comment now.
Sure, so I have a couple things to add, maybe a little bit of context for you guys.
So, yeah, there are a couple of guidelines for citizen comment generally, and one is, keep it to 3 minutes, state your name and state your address.
No problem.
All right.
Is this on? Yeah. My name's Dominic Andrella. My address is 18549 60th Avenue Northeast, Kenmore. Couple of things that I jotted down while we were listening to the discussion. I'm very curious to know more about how the city decides how to object with one of these reports and under what basis you'd consider a report invalid. I totally understand the need to question a bogus report from a geotech, but it also feels like the engineer bears a lot of that risk by stamping a report like this that's inaccurate. Reasons not to agree to a geotech that the city suggests. The stuff that I came up with were price, lead time, and their reputation or customer service. We just engaged with the geotech and had a critical areas report done for our property, and we started that process in July and got the report earlier this week. So and in total, we had to pay the commission for actually finding the guy, right? That any of general that you're working with or architect you're working with wants a 15% cut from everything that you're doing. We had to pay for a topographical survey of the entire property so that a geotech would come out and look at it. And then we had to pay the geotech his fee as well. That totaled to more than $4,000 for us. And if you're paying for an additional geotech, right, because the city doesn't like what you found, it's going to get much more expensive from there. You're right about that. So that's about all I got. The one more thing. I'm not sure if a geotech is capable of reviewing one of these reports without being on site and making legitimate conclusions about how accurate the report is. Our geotech had to be on site 3 or 4 different times, had to dig holes in the ground and look for very specific evidence to be sure about the claims that he put in this report. And I'm not confident that someone could read one sitting in an office here and know right away, oh, this is legit, versus this guy didn't do what he actually said he was going to do, or make the right conclusions. So, thanks.
Thanks, Dominic, for that. Lori, did you want to respond to any of that? It sounds like a lot of this is sort of internal review standards
Right.
by the city, not so much what we do, but.
Yeah, I think probably what I can do that will help this discussion is to spend some time with development services and say, tell me the exact process, tell me how you decide, when do you determine that another report is, I just need to do some more research
Right,
over
so
those issues.
would it make sense for either Dominic to contact you or you to contact him, or? with
Either
his
way, yeah, either way. I'll bring the information back to the commission, so I'm happy to add you to the commission mailing list. That'd be a piece of information I would report back to the commission on, or I can give you a call, whatever works. If you want to sign up with Bridget, I don't know if you did, but, yeah, perfect.
Thank you. All right. Anything else? Yes, Vice Chair.
I just want to know if Doug and Scott are going to be at the next meeting?
Yes.
Next
Will
meeting,
you be at the next meeting?
you know, my son is coming in from the East Coast on the 18th, and I'm not sure I'm going to
Okay.
be here.
All right.
Well, if this is our last meeting, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Scott, for your service. We've been lucky to have you on the commission.
Thanks, it's a learning process.
Indeed. All right. Anything else? Any new business? I think I have to ask that before I. No new business, no announcements. Therefore, this meeting is hereby adjourned. Thank you, everybody.